Hey everyone, I'm Tim Foote, CEO of Slingshot Group, where we partner with churches and organizations to find and coach great leaders, build remarkable teams and healthy culture. I'm joined today by Brandon Cormier, lead pastor of Zeal Church in Colorado Springs and staffing and coaching associate at Slingshot Group. Having been called to plant Zeal Church and lead the charge on building culture, Brandon has seen a lot of culture over his years in ministry. So Brandon, let's talk about how you have pioneered fresh, new culture and what that's been like for you.
Yeah, so over the span of about 14 years in local church ministry, been a part of churches and ministries with extremely healthy culture where people are thriving, leaders are rising to the top, gifts are being brought, culture of honor, all of those things. And unfortunately, I've also been a part of churches with some pretty dysfunctional culture. And so now as a lead pastor, whom I would say the role of the lead pastor or even a senior leadership team is to be the cultural architects, the chief cultural architects in the organization or in the church. And so in building a culture that I would say is pretty healthy and pretty strong at our church, we've had to make some intentional decisions and prioritizing culture literally above just about everything else. Second to the gospel and the preaching of the word, culture must come just beneath that.
Yeah. Brandon, in this series, we've been talking about the fact that culture is currency.
Yeah.
Also the importance of employee brand for the people on your team and how they experience your organization. It's great to talk to you about the experience building culture from the ground up so recently. Has that been something you've been thinking about consciously, or is it something that you just knew and felt and understood? And how would you define healthy culture?
There's a bit of intuitiveness, I think, whenever you've led at high levels in an organization before, where you realize, oh, this is really important to the culture of who we are and how to define it. And so for me, it was very intuitive. In building something from the ground up, I realized very quickly our way matters. How would I define healthy culture? What would the indicators or the demarcations be in an organization or a church with healthy culture? Number one, I would say that any healthy culture is life-giving. How do you define life-giving? One of my mentors would say this: it's hard to define a life-giving culture. You either are or you are not. We start from a place of yes, like, does this have life on it? Is this building other people up? Secondly, I would say an indication of a healthy culture is the team feels safe and they feel empowered. And by safe and empowered, I mean this: those things are evidenced by conversation and leadership decisions. You will have more courageous conversations whenever a leader in your organization in a healthy culture feels safe than you will if they do not. Additionally, a leader will feel empowered to make decisions, carry authority whenever there is a healthy culture, as opposed to whenever the culture is unhealthy.
It's really interesting, Brandon, because I've watched at Zeal Church from afar how just your volunteer teams own your culture. And being a part of Slingshot Group, you've seen how important to us our values are that define 100%. Us as slingers, the name that we give our associates internally, and how that drives that yes culture. You know, we say yes. If it's a no, we say, let me consider that for a minute. Or let me think about that. Also, I loved it when you said that there's the gospel and then there's culture. That's so important. What's the cost when you don't pay attention to culture?
Oh, goodness. Because I would say culture eats vision for breakfast every single day. The cost is we can still arrive at the destination of the vision. But as kingdom citizens, I think that the way matters. And for me, one of the additional definitions that I give culture is it is our way of getting to our destination. What does it profit a man to gain the whole world and lose his soul? As a play on that is, what does it profit a church to gain their vision? But in the process of making it to that destination, we've compromised our integrity. We've compromised the way that Christ has called us to get there. From what I can see in the Bible, Jesus cares as much about the way as he does the destination, the journey, as he does the destination, the final outcome.
Okay, so let's take that a little bit further, Brandon. You talked about Jesus caring as much about the journey as he does about the destination.
Yeah.
It's all about the growth and our understanding of him.
Yeah.
And on that journey, as he leads us to a new season, we're always a sum of our experiences. And you've
Sure.
had some rich ministry experiences as
Yeah.
you stepped into planting Zeal. Can you talk a little bit more about let's talk about 3 things
Okay.
that hurt culture?
Probably the number one thing that comes to mind in terms of what hurts culture is whenever the leadership, be it the senior leader or the leadership team, makes decisions to compromise culture or to adapt the set culture in order to please men, to please followers. Whenever we started Zeal Church after about 13 years of very effective leading at high levels within large churches, mostly in the realm of youth and college ministry, I would say I've never felt the temptation in a greater way to compromise the way that Jesus has called me to lead or to vision cast or to raise up leaders, discipleship, all of those things. Never to the extent of planting a church. Why? Because whenever you're in sort of desperate places, like you need people, churches are run, let's be clear, majority by volunteers, by those who are sacrificing their time. So the temptation is, oh yeah, we'll tweak that if it makes you happy, if it's convenient for you. I think that's the greatest temptation. And in the first couple of months, I felt that tug like I've never felt in 13, 14 years or so of full-time ministry. And I had to have, both my wife and I had to have some very clarifying, very gut-checking conversations of, are we gonna compromise in this area? Because if we do, where does it end? The second sort of big mistake I see in terms of hurting a healthy culture would be number 2, is if I am not embodying what I am saying on a private level, on a personal level. Again, we as a senior leaders or senior leadership teams are the chief cultural, not only architects, but we're the chief cultural carriers.
Right.
There will be it will lead to internal frustration whenever you are heralding a culture publicly that you are not carrying privately. Another assassin, I would say, to culture is if we as leaders, or if I as a leader am not open to feedback. Whenever we don't have feedback embedded into culture, in my opinion, you cannot have a healthy culture to the degree that you should or could without also having somewhere in your culture a feedback loop where feedback is welcomed. And in our organization, in our church, you can push back on many things. You can question for a sake of clarity the culture. But beyond that, it's like, no, we're not, like, this is who we are. But you can always push back and say, okay, why? Like, I want to understand, because if the why is clearly defined for your people, but if you don't have a culture of feedback, people are it's going to lead to fear. It's going to lead to dysfunction at some level or another.
And that requires secure leadership to have that kind of feedback. I like the way you put it. So to sum it up, our 3 culture assassins, if you like.
Number 1 was to adapt the culture in order to please
That's
others.
right. So people pleasing would be the first culture assassin. The second would be duplicity.
Yes.
and the third would be a closed posture, not being open to feedback.
Correct.
So Brandon, what's one thing that churches and organizations listening today could do this week or this month to invest in their culture and guard against these 3 culture assassins. What I love about the stage you're at, Brandon, is you've just recently planted a church and you didn't have a big staff. You relied on a bunch of volunteers and there are organizations and churches listening or watching today that may rely solely on volunteers, that may have a team of 30 to 50 staff over that. What's some advice you'd give about one thing they could do to guard against these cultures?
I would say one thing that leaders can immediately do this week is to bring clarity to their culture. I often like to say, to be clear is to be kind. And so I would start by asking, because again, it's the whole feedback situation. Asking their volunteers, if you had to define our church, if you had to say, what are 2 of our cultural values that we carry in our DNA as a church? What would that be? And as a leader, sort of assess and see where the gap is. Now, let me start off by saying there will be a gap. So let's just be honest. Let's just be expectant of that, okay? But that will give clarity as to where the gap is, and then give clarity. Oh, those are the 2 things. Those are the common. That's so far away from what's in my heart and the way that God has called us to build this, and begin to define that very clearly.
So as we watch and listen, there's one thing you can do today to define the clarity of your culture. Maybe even look again at the values that you will hold to no matter what happens in ministry that defines who you are and defines your culture. Great to have you with us, Brandon, as we talk more about this. And remember, stay curious and reach for the remarkable.